Alright, so in the last video we were talking about software step generation. And you're wondering, whoa, why can't we use that for everything? Well, doing software step generation, you're kind of limited. In the computer, running Linux CNC with real time, in this setup you'd have two threads. You'd have, let's say, a 1 kilohertz. This is called the servo thread. And this is what, like the PID in motion is all running within. The step gen, because we need to run faster than 1 kilohertz, has a separate thread. It's actually running two threads. Part of the step gen software is running at 1 kilohertz. The actual step generation part that creates the pulses is running a faster thread. Let's say most computers can run a 50 microsecond thread. So that equates to about 20 kilohertz of step generation, which for a lot of things that's probably perfectly fine. But 20 kilohertz is kind of slow for some things. Some computers can get down into 20 microsecond. You can approach 40 to 50 kilohertz on decent, really good computer hardware. So, that's your limitation with software computer step generation. So what do? Well, with Linux CNC, there's a couple options. We're going to look at Mesa because that's what I'm familiar with. So we're going to get rid of this stuff, because this stuff stays the same. But now we have a software module that's, I don't know what it's called, but it's from the Mesa hardware. So what this does, let's make this bigger. Because within this software, you can configure it depending on what hardware you have, and it really depends on what interface you have. This real world part can be Ethernet, PCI, or even there's a communication with the printer port. So this is then the connection to the actual physical Mesa hardware. Spell it right. Anyway, so this connection is also real time. Whether it being Ethernet, PCI, or printer port. Anyway. So what happens then is if you're doing step, pulse width modulation, or encoder counting, that high-speed stuff is done out here in the external interface hardware versus doing a fast thread in the computer. So now the computer only needs to be running a 1 kilohertz servo thread that runs the motion and the Mesa hardware, or Mesa software part in the computer. And the Mesa software module has the stuff to communicate with the actual Mesa external hardware. So within the software part, you can configure step gen, PWM, and encoders, among other things. There's like resolver, readers, and all kinds of stuff that you can enable within the Mesa software layer. That really depends on what kind of actual physical hardware you have. Mesa has all kinds of daughter boards that you plug in, and then magically pins appear in the software part of it that you can then connect. So in this situation, if we're going to do stepper motors, let's say, you would enable some step gens within the Mesa hardware that you would connect like you would the software step generation. You would set it up as a velocity mode step generator within the Mesa, and it would feed back a position that you would hook to the feedback. So now the computer doesn't have to do as much stuff because it's not trying to generate high-speed step generation. That's all done on the external hardware. And then the software just does the stuff the computer does well, the floating point, the PID loop, the communication with the real-time external hardware. So this would be another step gen or a stepper system where out here you'd have these, depending on the card you have from Mesa, you would have an output that would go to the stepper drive, and it would send out high-speed pulses, and this can do then, say, megahertz frequency step generation, or pulse width modulation, or read encoders into the megahertz, where on the computer, if you were doing it software-wise, you'd be limited to, let's say, 40 to 50 kilohertz reading encoders or outputting step generation. So that's kind of how within the computer you have this PAL layer that you hook all this stuff together. And it isn't just PID, you have logic like AND gates and muxes that you can switch outputs. It's really amazing. It's